Welcome to the Lawless Astrology channel. My name is Dabney Lawless, and I'm an evolutionary astrologer. Today, I'm excited to welcome Sam Reynolds from Unlock Astrology. He is an astrologer, he is a consultant, he's a speaker and a teacher, and he's very, very well respected within the astrological community. And I don't know if he has any spots open, but I'm going to put a link below. He is going to be teaching at the OPA conference, the Organization for Professional Astrologers, next month in October. So, welcome, Sam. Today we're going to be talking about
Thank you for
essential
having me.
dignities, right?
Thank you for
Essential
having me,
dignities.
Debney.
You're
That's what we're going
welcome.
to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry I didn't
So,
talk over you.
no, it's okay. I think I was talking over you.
So, okay, here's officially welcome, Sam. And yeah, take it away. And what exactly does that mean? Essential dignities in astrology.
Yeah. So, and I've spent decades at this point um, trying to understand and dive deep into what are essential dignities and are they essential? And there are two words to really understand about essential dignities. One is essential, meaning essence, and that's what really is important. In their essence, when planets are in particular positions, they have more dignity. And what does dignity mean? Dignity comes from Latin for dignitatum, and dignitatum is also a way of understanding how one has a sense of belonging. It's not just dignity, it's also related to power and whether you have the authority and the sense of belonging to be able to do a particular thing. So, for instance, I'm assuming we're both in our respective homes, right? So, if I were to come out to where you are and I landed at your doorstep, although I would probably send a text or we would arrange a time beforehand. Um, but if I landed at your doorstep and said, "Hey, Dabney, I'm thirsty. Could you give me a drink of water?" The expectation would be in you hosting me that you have the power and full authority to be able to give me a glass of water. Now, what would be strange is if you suddenly got on the phone and you were like, "Look, I have a friend here and he would like a glass of water from the refrigerator. Can I give him a glass of water?" Um, yeah, sure. Now that would be strange because, like, well, who are you calling that you can't go in your own fridge, which I'm presuming is your fridge, to be able to do the things that you want to do? And so this is how we can understand a planet, whether it's in its dignity or not, whether it has the sense of belonging, whether it has the power to be able to do the thing that it wants to do. Now, a planet is always itself, just like you are always yourself, ideally, in your home, but you may feel more able or better able to do particular things in your home. So, for instance, if you wanted to walk around nude, you could do that in your own home. If you wanted to wear your Pokemon pajamas, you could do that, right? All the different things that you would want to do, if you wanted to get sloppily drunk in your own home, right? That's where you have this presence to be able to do that. Now, the planets again, but you're still going to be Dabney.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like Mars in Libra loses the ability to be Mars, but he may feel out of place. So for instance, if you were in my home, um, you wouldn't just like, oh, say, "Oh, I see a fridge over there. Let me just walk over and just see what Sam has in his fridge." We would both think, per our way of, being Americans and how we're raised or whatever, we would think that's rude, right? The same thing if I were in your house and being like, "Oh, is that like a Beaujolais that you have up there? Let me look." I don't even drink, but if I took that and was like, "Oh yeah, let's open it up," I would ask,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a Mars in Libra in a place hosted by Venus, may not feel like he has the authority to act the way he acts, the way he wants to act. So there's a different way in which he's negotiating his being. Again, that doesn't mean he's not Mars. It's just going to be how he encounters it. So essential dignity becomes different stages and ways we can understand belonging. The first level of understanding this, I'm going to share my screen in a second, is going to be related to what we call the Thema Mundi. And a lot of people think that rulership and that's what I'm going to focus on first. A lot of people think that rulership is more about, they would say, affinity. Mars rules Aries because it has an affinity related to it. Or we would say that Venus rules Taurus. That is not the logic behind rulership at all. And it wasn't even the initial logic. People think like, well, the ancient Mesopotamians were looking in the sky and they said, Abu Aka, I see Venus is doing better, and people are responding differently in Taurus. And then someone else was like, I see. I agree. I think now, Venus must be the ruler of Taurus. None of that happened. It never was a thing. So what was the thing? Well, without going too deep in the woods about this and the weeds, we're going to start off with, and I think you can see my screen. Is that correct? Where you can see
I,
the Thema Mundi,
I
right?
can see your screen, yeah. And
Okay.
and for everybody that's a beginner astrologer and you want to go back and like look at this because you're more of a beginner, you can go to my website and you can get a free beginner astrology workbook that has all of the symbols so you can follow really closely with what Sam is saying. So cuz I don't want to take away from what you're saying. So take it
Okay.
away.
So these are on the outer perimeter. What you're looking at are the signs, starting from Cancer. Now, one thing I'll say, there is a logic for why we start with Cancer rather than Aries with this. Um, One particular theory is the idea that Cancer and one of the fixed stars, Sirius, was the most honored star at the place of Hellenistic astrology's beginning, which is Egypt, which is in Africa. So it was viewed as this place. In this particular star, at the heliacal, what we say, the rising before the sun of this star was viewed as the beginning of the Egyptian New Year, along with the flooding of the Nile. And so the reason why we start from Cancer is believed to be because of this rising of Sirius.
Oh,
And Sirius is spelled Sirius. So we have this rising of the star, Cancer, I mean of Sirius, and that's in Cancer. So the sun, true to patriarchal roots, was said to rule all of the particular signs. But as the quote unquote king of heaven, because it is the source of all light in our solar system, it shares its authority with the moon, who shines more at night. So it becomes an embodiment of what we say the masculine, or I might say better, the assertive principle, and the receptive or feminine principle, which is the moon. So starting from the moon in Cancer and the sun in Leo, where it also in the northern hemisphere is hotter, and we experience the heat. This is why we have Cancer and the sun. Then, based on speed, starting from the first fastest moving body in the heavens, we have Mercury. But Mercury flanks the sun and the moon from either side, from Gemini and Virgo. So this is why we say that Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo. Then the next fastest is Venus. Then Venus flanks Mercury from Taurus and Libra. And then Mars does the same thing, and we start to get towards slower planets. Mars does this from Aries and Scorpio. Then, kind of rounding us almost home, is Jupiter from Pisces and Sagittarius. And then opposing the moon and the sun is the historical opposition, is Saturn from Aquarius and Capricorn. So this is it. It's looking at the geometry of light and speed as related to why the planets have their homes. And this is viewed as the top level related to rulership of essential dignity. So, the layers of essential dignity is rulership, then something that we call triplicity, then bounds, and then I think I'm missing one. Oh, I'm sorry. Is rulership, exaltation, then by bounds, or triplicity, sorry, then by bounds, and then by what we call face. And face Also is known as decans. So that's dividing it up by thirds. So 10 degrees for each sign of the zodiac. And there's a different order for that, which I'll show very quickly right now.
Okay,
let me
before
stop
you
sharing.
leave, I just want to say I've been an astrologer for over 20 years and I've never seen it explained this way.
Mm.
And I think it's blowing my mind. That's so interesting and fascinating because I think I was sort of like in the camp of like it's a tradition that we knew different rulership. And so I'm showing my hand here that I've never been taught it this way and this just makes absolute sense. And so thank you. You've taught me something
Oh,
new.
wonderful.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, really
there's a
cool.
symmetry to it. There's a beauty. Once I learned this, and I didn't learn this until about 10 years plus of being an astrologer. And this is more the traditional Hellenistic, Islamic, medieval view. And this was what was explained in every astrological text in terms of rulership. But it got lost more so in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. So this is why we have it in spelled out the way that it is in terms of its breakdown. The next thing I'll share, um, hold on one second. Let me find it. I think it should open up. Is this table of essential dignities? So, and I'll zoom in a little bit. So where you see, and this is from Chris Brennan, from his book, Hellenistic Astrology, where he breaks down the astrology. I think the subtitle is something like the astrology of fate. Here you have the signs of the zodiac. Domicile means the same as what I was talking about in terms of rulership and the idea of home.
Mhm.
So I've explained that in terms of starting from Aries all the way to Pisces. Exaltation is traditionally described as your home away from home. So for instance, if um, my niece's, family member, right? If my niece came to visit me here in Santa Fe, right, I would treat her as an honored guest. She would have some way in which I might even give her my own bed and then sleep in this office. So exaltation means that this planet is highly honored by virtue, and there are different theories on why exaltation happens the way it does. Um, so I'll give my theory, but I do want to emphasize that there are other theories, and it's it's less stable, I would say, and simplistic and as rulership. So it's a little more complicated in terms of the various theories you have. So the sun is exalted in Aries, and you might say, like, well, why is that? Well, if we were looking at it just in terms of, again, the northern hemisphere, and we were looking at it just in terms of seasonally, and I think I have a different theory, but I'm giving you at least one other one, is that the sun literally seems to come back to life after its, death from the fall into winter, and then, slowly making its way back until like life springs back to life, literally spring,
Mhm.
in terms of the vernal equinox. And that's one particular theory. You might say, then why is the moon exalted in Taurus? Another complement to this theory is that the moon can never be too far from the sun, because they're together in rulership. So if the sun is exalted in Aries, then the moon is seen as being exalted um, in the sign of Taurus.
Yep.
Now, my theory is more so related to relationships, almost like a Game of Thrones, in terms of alliances. So one thing you may notice is that so the sun is received by Mars in Aries, and the moon is received by Venus. Both of these are respectively called the lesser of their kind. Mars is the lesser malefic, Venus is the lesser benefic, meaning that, and malefic, people always think, oh, it means that they're bad. No, it means that they do the things that are demanded by necessity that we don't always want to deal with. Clean your room, do the dishes, um, have a war, all these other particular things that are maybe difficult or others wouldn't want to do. Venus is called the lesser benefic because it's all the things we really enjoy doing, right? Like, well, I like eating, but what about the dishes that are, gathering up in the sink? Okay, they're gathering in the sink. Can I get more ice cream? So these are the things that we kind of think about in terms of benefic, what we want to see as, pleasurable or even good. But it doesn't mean that benefics are always good because, if you just kind of go along with your pleasure and not do the harder thing, you're going to have problems. That's why we just don't feed all our kids ice cream just because they like ice cream, as an example. So here we got the breakdown. So the sun is received in a home of Mars, and the moon is received in the home of Venus. This is where it starts to get interesting. Jupiter is received in the home of the moon. And that's because Jupiter seems more favorable related to, the growth of life, and kind of, and also mythologically, Zeus, who roams a lot, does better at home. That's another way we can tie it in. Mercury, traditionally, as versus what many may have heard or seen, that Mercury is exalted in Virgo, not Aquarius, traditionally. Now you're like, well, why am Virgo? Well, because Mercury cannot ever be too far from the sun. So it only can be up to what I believe, some 23 degrees or so, or something like that. And so Mercury, by virtue of that, can never be that far. So it makes sense that since the home of the sun is Leo, that it's right by the sun in terms of its exaltation, where it feels well received. Now, Venus is kind of dual. If the sun is received, now, if you think about the sun and Saturn as natural opposition and quote unquote enemies, Venus does another thing. If Mars is receiving the sun and Venus also receives the moon, then by exaltation, Venus receives Saturn. If the sun is exalted in Aries, then Saturn's exalted in Libra. Where the sun thrives, then where the sun thrives, then Saturn does not. So Saturn thrives where the sun does not. So sun is said to be in his fall in Libra, whereas Saturn thrives. Then Mars, we have for Scorpio, nothing is exalted in Scorpio. Like, well, why is that? Well, because if anything, like the king and queen of heaven, sun and moon, if the moon is kind of put down, then we're not going to have a place where someone is going to thrive in that particular way. Similarly, there's nothing in Sagittarius, although technically it's said to be exalted by for the nodes. So the south node is said to be exalted in Sagittarius. I've never seen that done in practice. So in all these years, the north node is exalted in Gemini, the south node is exalted in Sagittarius. I've never seen it really used. Now, note this. So Saturn takes in his lesser kind. So Saturn is the greater malefic. Mars is exalted in Capricorn. So he takes it in. Similarly, Jupiter, the greater benefic, takes in Venus because they're of the same kind. So I think it's more a matter of, like, when I say Game of Thrones is like Chutes and Ladders, where it's more by a certain aspects of affinity and connection, almost like, intrigue, like Venus taking in Saturn, Mars taking in Sun, Saturn taking in Mars, Jupiter taking in Venus. Now, there are different theories. Again, as I said, some people like to go with the idea, well, Mars is exalted in Capricorn because he needs discipline. It's much more psychological. But when you look at the classical ideas of positioning, they weren't very psychological as much. They looked at things in a simpler sensibility in terms of the nature of the planet, not so much like, well, this is just what you need. There is some of that, but not too much. Some of that comes out more related to what we call triplicity. And I'm giving you one set of triplicities from the astrologer Dorotheus. There are different triplicities given by Ptolemy, and Ptolemy changes one major thing, which I'll get to when as I go through. So for all the fire signs, then the sun, Jupiter, depending on whether it's a day chart or a night chart, are the triplicity lords. Now, again, if Exaltation means you're received as an honored guest. Then what does triplicity mean? This is more so where you have a sense of familiarity related to family or of a similar nature of things. So if I were interrogating your chart to figure out how your wealth might function or how you might deal with the resources from family or whatever, then we would look along the family line, the connections between the sun, in this for fire signs, sun, Jupiter, and then a participating one, meaning that it can step in to kind of contribute as an extra vote from Saturn. And this is true for all the fire signs because fire and air signs will tend to use Saturn and Jupiter because they belong to what we call the day sect. This is getting a little more complicated, but there is sects, not sex, but sects related to the
Yes.
day. Yeah, SECT and then S, but sect relates to the day and then for the night. So for the day sect is headed by the sun, and it draws in Jupiter and Saturn, and then occasionally Mercury, depending on whether Mercury is rising before the sun, which is for day, or setting after the sun for night. For the nocturnal or night sect, it's going to be the moon leading the way, the head of the sect, then Venus and Mars, and then sometimes Mercury, depending on whether, again, it's a morning star or evening star setting afterward. So what does this mean?
Can I ask you a
Yeah.
quick question?
Yeah.
Are you a Hellenistic astrologer, Sam?
No, but I am traditional,
Okay, so you're traditional. And so I was
which ties in principles from the Hellenistic tradition, the Islamic tradition, and the medieval tradition. Mainly the astrological tradition before the 18th, 19th, and then 20th centuries.
okay, because I don't use triplicity, so I think this is really fascinating. And I was wondering, is this something that traditional astrologers like this is an important factor that they
Yeah,
use?
they would use it. Yeah. To
Okay.
as kind of giving more nuances related to the chart. So here, all the earth signs will have in this order Venus for the day, moon at night, and then Mars is participating. And then for all the air signs, then it'll be Saturn as, what you look at as the head, for, like that, Mercury in Libra, Saturn might be the Lord during a day chart.
Mhm.
And what that means is Saturn can look out and provide some measure of support in terms of a particular planet in the air sign, whether it's the moon, blah, blah, blah. Now, if it's a night chart, it's going to be Mercury hitting the way, and Jupiter kind of contributes to this. Then finally, and I say finally because you'll notice that this repeats all the way through. Finally, for water signs, this is the distinction between Dorotheus and Ptolemy. Ptolemy does something unusual in terms of what other astrologers of his era would do, which is kind of more so have Mars be the day and night triplicity lord. So it would be Mars, Mars, Moon. But Dorotheus and other astrologers of his era would have Venus during the day for Cancer and Mars at night, and then Moon as participating. And then this repeats for all the different signs, in terms of their elemental nature. What gets more complicated is something we call bounds or terms. Now, bounds or terms are divisions, 5 divisions, excluding the sun and the moon. Sun and moon are not put in here, more like the other visible planets, the 5 visible planets, who are given domain, power, we could say sense of belonging, at different divisions of the zodiac. So for the first 6 degrees, meaning up into the 6th degree of Aries, Jupiter has term power. Now, by the way, 6 degrees actually goes up to 5 degrees and 59 minutes, not the 6th degree. You're like, well, why? Well, very simple reason. It's because, oh, okay, yeah, I zoomed in. Very simple reason. This is called ordinal, meaning we start from 0, and from 0 to 1, that actually is the first degree, not 1. From 0 minutes, and let's say 13 minutes up to 59 minutes, which is just at the cusp of a degree, that's your first degree. So for the first 6 degrees, from 0 up to the sixth one, which is actually 5 degrees, 59 minutes, Jupiter is the lord of that particular term. Now, the natural question the student may have is like, cool, what does that mean that they're the term lord? The analogy I like to give is that when you're in school, like elementary school or high school or middle school, you may have a principal, right? And you have a principal who is the head of the school in that sense. But when you're in that classroom, who has supreme authority? Your teacher. So if you wanted to go to the bathroom and your teacher wouldn't let you out, it's kind of useless to say, I'm going to tell Mr. Weganowski that you wouldn't let me out. Okay. If you could get to the phone and let him know, or you could get to the hallway and let him know. You can't. So the term lords actually, historically and traditionally, had a lot of power because they relate to the immediacy of what a planet is allowed to do, and it will follow the conditions of the term lord. So, for instance, I'm gonna create a life for you, meaning like you have kids, and I'm still that visitor, right? And let's say you're gonna put me in. I don't think you would do it, but let's say it's like he's 18. You have a son, and you put me in his room with him, right? And you're like, okay, we're gonna stay over there. Now, I'm gonna make up a name for your son, Timmy, right? You put me in Timmy's room. Now, when I'm in Timmy's room, even though you're the head of the household in that sense, I probably have to abide more by Timmy's rules to some degree. You're like, don't touch that, right? Oh, you have a computer. Yep, my computer. Now, maybe your this imaginary child is not that selfish or whatever, but I would be under the terms of Timmy in that particular situation. Even though going back to rulership and domicile, that's more at the head. So we can think of these particular planets at these different degrees as we go through the whole zodiac, having this level of power. Decans or faces, this is very different than how many people may have learned decans. So there's a Hellenistic way, and then there's an Indian way. And there's a way that in the West, we've kind of appropriated the one from India. So let me show you the one that I learned first. And then, and this is a division of each zodiac sign by 10 degrees. So it goes up until the 10th degree, and then it goes from 10 degrees to up until just the 20th degree, and then from the 20th degree up until 2959 of that sign. So the way I first learned it is that for Aries, it would be Mars, as Mars is indeed the ruler of Aries. Going along with the idea of triplicity, then the next fire sign after Aries is Leo. And so it would be the sun. And this is still true. But then the next sign, fire sign after that, is Jupiter or Sagittarius. So we would expect Jupiter there. And instead we have Venus. Now, I will explain this in a second, but this is maybe how people may have learned this. I'll go to the next one to make sure we illustrate it clearly. Then for Taurus, the expectation is that we would have Venus there. Then for the next Earth sign, which is Virgo after Taurus, we would have Mercury. And then the next sign after that is Capricorn, where we do indeed have Saturn. So you're like, well, why do we have some overlap and not? Well, there's a different logic that's applied for decans using the traditional model than it is for what I say for the Indian model. When you say, like, why are you saying it's Indian? It literally is from India, in terms of its history.
Right.
So Mars, you might remember when I was talking about speed and going back to the Thema Mundi. Oops, I didn't mean to go over there, but here's the Thema Mundi. Terms of speed, we actually this isn't following that, but the sun is actually the next next fastest planet after Mars if we were going backwards. And then it would be Venus, and then it would be Mercury. So when we look at this table, it's Mars, then the sun, then Venus, and then again we go to the next line, it's Mercury to the fastest, which is the moon, repeat. Now Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, repeat. And it goes all the way down to Mars. That is the logic behind it, which is
Fascinating.
very different than the logic that was presented from India. Again, you're like, well, which one is better? I don't get into better. I just I try to maintain the consistency of a system,
Hmm.
and that's what I focus in on, is the consistency of the system. You know, if I were more of a Vedic astrologer, this is what I would use. What do
Right.
decans relate to? Well, decans become much more um, related to the impression, you know, the visible way in which they shape things. So it's kind of like it's said to be a weaker dignity going in order of, you know, domicile being having what, 5 points, exaltation said to have 4 points, triplicity having three, bounds and terms having 2 points, and then decans and faces having 1 point. But the better way to think about it, rather than like, oh, weaker or stronger, is that when a planet is in its own face, it has some mobility. And the kind of way in which I make break it down is that domicile would be more like, okay, I'm at home. Exaltation is someplace where it's like home for me, but isn't my home. Where I might go to like a sibling's house or my niece's house and, you know, have a comfortable bed. Like when I go to her place, she treats me as an honored guest, as her uncle.
Hmm.
And so I have a nice bedroom, blah, blah, blah. Then triplicity lords might be more akin to the idea of family, where I mentioned my niece, but it might be, you know, good friend, your network is how we might relate to triplicity. In terms of terms, this might be more defined as where I have some measure of authority, but it's conditional. And this might be more along the lines of where we work, like our job, right?
Hmm. Yep.
So you're not going to treat your job or have the same level of authority ideally at your job as you might have at home. And it's again conditional, because like if you were fired, right, you probably wouldn't have those same, powers. You know, your pass wouldn't work, or being able to kind of go in. So it's kind of having some measure of conditional power. And then we can say by face, it might be that you have some measure, you have your skills, you have, like, going along with that analogy, you have your skills, you have a certain ability. If you have a planet in its own face, like let's say you have a sun in Aries and it's at 11 degrees Aries, that means it's in the second decan and it has some measure of its conditional power. The other thing to know about decans is that more medieval Islamic astrologers would break down the decans as having particular meanings. If you want to get a clue about this, this is also true in tarot. So there's a book written by T. Susan Chang, um, that's called The 36 Faces, where she's breaking down parts of the tarot related to the decans.
I will put a link to that uh,
Okay.
below.
T.
So,
Susan Chang.
okay, that's interesting. Okay, great.
So it's understanding these different levels of dignity. So okay, this is all great and nice and abstraction, but what does it really look like in life? So let me stop sharing and let me share a chart. And I'm going to share one of my favorite charts. I call it a FUBAR chart. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the acronym, um, I will say you know what it means, but for those who don't, what is a FUBAR chart? It means effed up. I'm not going to say the F because I don't know how you abide by things, but
Yeah,
effed up
probably
beyond.
not a good
What'd
idea.
you say?
Probably not a good idea just because of the
Okay.
algorithm, but that's the only reason.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'd be effing it all day long.
Effed up beyond all recognition or all relief. It depends on which one you want to use. And you're like, well, why is this a FUBAR chart? Is this person messed up? Well, the person wasn't messed up, but they have messed up positions for their planets. So the moon is in rulership. I'm going to start with the moon, and I'll get my annotator. The moon starts off in a place that isn't its home. So its home is Cancer, and what it's called its detriment is Capricorn. So the moon is in Capricorn. So it's out of its home. And you're like, well, what's the condition of that? Well, it's like you being someplace that isn't quite your home, that is almost like the opposite of your home. So
You're
for instance,
uncomfortable there.
you're uncomfortable there. Yeah, it's kind of more like me, I'm here in, relatively sunny, I might need to turn on the light. Santa Fe, is kind of going back to cloudy like the southeast right now, where there's a hurricane. And I hope all those people are safe. Um, but yeah, there's a hurricane going on there. That would be pretty uncomfortable for me, right? So that's like the moon in Capricorn. So similarly, the sun thrives in Leo. What's its opposite place? Aquarius. So this person has a sun in Aquarius. Where does the Mercury feel both in rulership and exaltation? In Virgo. Well, Mercury here is in Pisces, the opposite sign. Okay. So this is one, we have 3 planets already out of the traditional 7 that are in positions that aren't comfortable for them. The only one that really is ideally at home is Jupiter, and Jupiter's in Pisces. That's one of his homes. Okay, Jupiter has it, which is good because he's the ruler of the ascendant. We use, Sagittarius, and we use, traditional rulers. Venus is in Aries, where she thrives better in Libra, so she's also out of her home. Then we can go up to Mars, and Mars thrives in Aries, but he's out of his home and he's in Libra. So when you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, um, we see that 5 planets out of 7 are not in their dignity. Saturn isn't quite home either. He's in Sagittarius, but he's not necessarily too far out of his place. He's what we call peregrine, meaning he's a wanderer outside of any place he feels comfortable or uncomfortable. So he is peregrine. You're like, okay. So by virtue of that, because the sun is also listed here as peregrine, and I'll go over this in a minute, this table of essential dignities. So what does this mean? Well, the expectation is you look at this and this person has had a bad life. They weren't well received, maybe didn't feel loved, especially with the Venus, maybe they didn't achieve love. And if you thought all of that, you would be wrong.
Mhm.
Okay. And this is why I say understanding essential dignities, whether they're strong and whether they're quote unquote weak, like this particular chart, does not mean you're effed up or you're an effed up person or a bad person, or just by virtue of that, you're gonna have like an awful life. This person had to go more against the grain. And so what I've come to define planets that are in their essential debilities, where they're quote unquote weak, I would define that more if we're talking about a life where you may have to go against the grain or the expectations of others and carve out your own way. Whereas we could say that when planets are at home or having their dignity, they can rely on some measure of convention and conformity and ways in which they feel well received. But there may be still some, depending on the placement of the planet, in what house, there may be some challenges. But in this particular person's case, who I will reveal in a minute, this person did face challenges, but had a good life, got to travel extensively. Um, and once I say their name, you're going to know who this person is. And it's one of my favorite people to know of. This is the chart of Charles Darwin.
So cool.
So when you realize how defiant his ideas were, because he was not a defiant person. In fact, he was very reluctant to publish his ideas because he knew the impact that evolutionary thinking would have on people. And so he was very reluctant to do that, but he did his research and realized this is what he discovered. And that was very much against the grain of his day. because most people were convinced the Earth is 6,000 years old. What do you mean it's millions of years old and that we came from primates? That's absurd. We've come to accept, some of us, we've come to accept some notion of this as common knowledge, but this was not common knowledge in the 19th century. Interestingly enough, Charles Darwin does have an astral twin born February 12th, 1809, but in America, his astral twin, who also went against the grain, is Abraham Lincoln. So they have
Okay,
similar
now
charts. They have the same positions.
does
So,
everyone understand why I invited Sam on here? Because he is such a great teacher. This is like so incredible, so interesting, right? And I
thank
love
you.
that you're talking too about, you don't know the soul's condition. You don't know like what someone does with their chart. So that's really interesting. I'll let you go on, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but like that's
No, I'm glad the excitement is infectious because, like I said, I really love talking about this chart because I love Darwin. I love his ideas and what he's done for understanding and humanity. Now, I'll briefly go over this table of essential dignities, and I know it creates a lot of calamity for different people. So one thing to know off the bat is that this chart is a night chart. So, and how I know it's a night chart because the sun is below the horizon. The horizon is the cusp of the first and seventh houses. So if the sun had been above the horizon, it would be a day chart, like this cursor that you're looking at, but now it's below. So that's going to change the triplicity lords. Um, and that's pretty much it. Now, let me say this about points. The initial Hellenistic notion of dignity that we're using didn't have a point system. This is something that comes directly from the Islamic and medieval tradition because both of those kinds of astrologers were very much interested in what's the strongest planet for particular things. How do we measure the strength of a planet to be able to determine, what we call the Almutin figurus, what that represents the essence and spirit of this person, or what might be the strongest planet related to a particular point in the chart for the first house, or all the way around, or what we call, you see here, there's different lots, which are calculations based on the the distance between 2 points or planets and then related to the ascendant, usually projected from the ascendant. So what we're looking at here is this point system. Now, what I always tell my students as well is that use the point system more as a guide. So the strongest planet here is Jupiter. This makes sense because Jupiter is the only planet that's at home, right? Jupiter starts off with 5 points. It gains additional points where you see this M and M and M based on mutual reception. Different traditions of astrology have different ways in which they understand mutual reception. What mutual reception means is that the planets can see each other and receive each other by virtue of that. So, just to kind of break it down, you would be receiving me in your home. Then if we had an arrangement where then, okay, you can stay here in Santa Fe, then I would receive you in my home. So that would be a mutual reception. So an example of this might be Sun in Aries with Mars in Leo. Sun is in a home of Mars, Aries, and then Mars is in the home of the Sun in Leo. Now, some astrologers say that the planets have to be able to have an aspect, what we call a Ptolemaic aspect, being able to see each other. We could equate seeing as related to being able to communicate. So if I stayed at your home but couldn't communicate with you and you weren't there, right? And no one in your home that stays there was there, and I asked you like, where are your mugs? Um, and you haven't met me yet, but I'm short. So, and they're like, let's say you're tall and you have them up on the third shelf and I can't see them. I'm like, I don't know where they are. And do you have like a step stool or anything? Um, and I couldn't be able to call you to learn that. So I guess I'll just be using, you know, hot glass tea or a glass to be able to do my tea or whatever. So that's kind of what I mean by being able to communicate. So the M that you're seeing is that somehow these planets, according to one way we might see it, can see each other and talk. That's not always true, but that's why they get additional points. So the moon is said to gain 2 points, you see here. And also you can lose points depending on where the moon is and everything else. So we won't get too much into that. But the moon has 3 points by virtue of being the triplicity lord. Remember, I told you that um, at night, then in an earth sign, uh, the moon in an earth sign is the secondary triplicity lord. So it gains 3 points. If it had been a day chart, it would have been Venus. So then somehow along the way, the moon lost a point, which I know it lost a point probably by virtue of being in detriment. The sun didn't gain any points, even though it has a mutual reception, but it lost points by virtue of being in Aquarius. So it's 6 degrees in peregrine, meaning that it has no essential dignity in that position. And when I say essential dignity, it has no perch or sense of power. So for instance, like if I were locked out of my house where I have rulership, where I have dominion and domain, but I have my phone and I have it fully charged, then at least I have some dignity by face, let's say. I have some ability to be able to, call my management company and say, can you, or a locksmith, can you let me in? Mercury has some dignity, but it loses a lot because it doesn't have any essential dignity, um, except by what we call mutual reception, which isn't that strong, but it doesn't have any dignity. And so when people see this, like it doesn't have any by triplicity or term, the Mercury, it doesn't mean that, your Mercury doesn't work. It more so means that it's not in its own sauce in that sense. Same thing for Venus. Now, Venus does have power by term. And so that gives his Venus, even though it's in Aries, a detriment, some ability to kind of navigate um, within the confines of a particular way. So, for instance, like, well, how did his Venus work? Did he find love? Yeah, he found love with his first cousin. Don't judge him.
Different
Um,
time.
different time, but he did find love with his first cousin who had, some money and a little more money than he did, and he did well related to his union and what Venus rules. So Venus rules his fifth house. Um, but he did have some struggles because he did lose a child. Um, you know, so this could signify, especially with the South Node, some trouble with the Venus, but he did have other children who survived. And it's important to remember that when we're talking about the 19th century, it was difficult for many children to survive. They could get all kinds of diseases. Um, so it wasn't like he was negligent. Mars doesn't have a lot of dignity. We could say he's peregrine, but again, this particular breakdown is using the M for mutual reception, so it gains some points. So it's not seen as peregrine. That's what the P stands for, peregrine. Peregrine means this is kind of like a free agent. So imagine a planet kind of not having a clear sense of direction. Doesn't mean it does bad things, but you don't know what it's going to do and always how it's going to perform. It
Okay,
might
can I
it's
interrupt? Because that reminds me of like Kramer from Seinfeld.
exactly.
Like he'll just bust in, but he doesn't really belong anywhere. He's a little unpredictable, and he's just gonna kind of do what he needs to do when he wants to do
And
it.
that's how Saturn did perform for them. Now, you might say, well, what about the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto? They don't belong to the schema, so they don't participate in it that way. So they're not used in traditional rulership. So that's kind of the breakdown related to understanding essential dignities. I guess we did do that under an hour. I feel
I
pretty
have one
tough.
question because I feel
Yeah.
like you've really explained everything very well, and you've covered probably like a 2-day workshop in an hour, right? Like, so this is, the sort of thing that people may have to watch multiple times to fully grasp all of the principles, but I think it really does give you like a comprehensive overview. What would you like? How would you explain the difference between detriment and fall? Because I feel like you did a really nice job of explaining rulership versus exaltation in that kind of your home setting, but detriment and fall, which I think that people, at least in the evolutionary astrology community, we use more ruler, exaltation, detriment, and fall, and the middle, triplicity term and face, are not things that we take as much into consideration. So I would love to just quickly get your take on detriment versus fall.
Awareness. So fall, you have more awareness of the condition, just like exaltation. I
Mhm.
would say exaltation is more a question of attitude. So you can actually the downside of exaltation, even though I use those analogies related to like my niece and who's like one of my close relatives. Um, the if I kind of came to her house as exaltation, like, well, can you do this for me? Like, here's my laundry, thanks, and I don't even ask her, right? It's where you might have more expectations. So fall is where you might have more awareness of realizing where things have gone badly. And then it's the opposite of pride. It can be shame. It can be where you feel like, or you could wallow, like like that famous line, I could have been a contender. It's kind of where you feel, regret all those particular things. Whereas detriment is where you may not know better. You may not, you just kind of do it because that's the way you do it. You kind of go against the grain because you don't know, you don't you don't care as much about convention. So fall may be more so where I care, but I feel like I I'm entitled to it. I can act badly because like, well, it's you know, you're unjust or whatever.
Right.
Whereas with detriment, I think about New Yorkers, and let me explain that. So people like, you don't like New York? I lived in New York for 20 years. Yes, I like New York. Um, but New Yorkers are funny to me because New Yorkers will travel different parts of the world. They'll go to Montreal, they'll go to, where you are. You take them to, a shop where the bagels, like, they're not like the bagels in New York. And you're like,
They're right, but
you're
yes.
not in, you're not in New
I didn't
York. So why are you expecting the, like, well, it's so hard to get a taxi here, like, well, because we all have cars. So sometimes a refusal to make an adjustment, with a detriment planet in recognizing that you're not at home. And so there's sometimes it's like stagger step, we could say. Whereas with fall, usually they're acutely aware of like, yeah, I'm in exile. I'm not at home. I know I'm not.
That's so helpful. That's really helpful to me personally as well to understand the difference between the two because I always know, like, I think of the planets as all having conversations with one another when I think of essential dignities.
Mm-hmm.
Do they like each other? Do they get along? Do they, speak the same language? But detriment and fall to me, it's always like uncomfortable. They don't get along, but I never really kind of had that full grasp of like, what's the difference between those two situations or the significance of how they express themselves. So that's a great analogy, so I love it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Sam, this has been very informative and very helpful. So yeah, I think if you have any questions, put them below. I will try to answer them, or if Sam pops in every once in a while, he can try and see if there's something he can answer. But my guess is that you may have to watch it a couple times and take notes because this is much more like a real class. But I think at least it gives you a really nice overview of what people are talking about when they say essential dignities. And I think it also gives you the opportunity if you want to see like the more basic stuff about, rulership, detriment, fall, all that's on the internet, pretty easily accessible. But like really understanding like what does this chart mean and why are all these points here? I think This is perfect. So thank you for coming on today. I really
Oh
appreciate it.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you having me, and I'm glad we got it in about an hour, and I look forward to meeting you in a few weeks.
That's right. We're both going to be at OPA. So there's going to be a lot of information about Sam below. I hope that you get a reading from him. I hope that you take classes from him because I know he teaches all sorts of places. And I think he has his own school that he just started, right? You are an organization that you
It's an
started.
organization of educators. We're not a school. We're trying to basically pull together educators in astrology to kind of coordinate more clear credentials. Yeah, and more ways in which we can help each other.
I love that. Okay, I'm going to have to get involved. So, all right. As always, everyone, there is a reason and a season for it all. And the universe is conspiring to help you. And so, if you are watching this, it's because you want to be an astrologer and you want to learn all about this stuff. So, make sure you look up Sam Reynolds. And
Thank you.
thanks.
Bye-bye.